Chapter 26 of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. And if I die, no soul will pity me. At last their long watchings, their tender care, directed by one of the most famous men in London, who was summoned to Wimperfield at Mr. Fosbroke's suggestion within a week of Dr. Mallison's visit, and attended twice or thrice a day by the clever apothecary, were rewarded by the assurance that the time of immediate danger was over, and that now a slow and gradual recovery might fairly be anticipated. It was only then that Ida could bring herself to face Brian again, and even then she met him with an icy look, as if the life within her were frozen by grief and care, and those rigid lips of hers could never again melt into smiles. Brian had been leading a fitful and wandering life during the boy's illness, watched and waited upon by Towler, the man from London, with whom he quarrelled 20 times a day, and who needed his long experience of the ways of alcoholic victims to enable him to endure the fitfulness and freakishness of his present charge. Warned by Dr. Mallison that he must spend as much of his life in the open air as possible, Brian had taken to going in and out of the house 50 times a day, now wandering for 5 or 10 minutes in the garden, anon rambling as far as the edge of the park, then running into the stable-yard, and ordering a horse to be saddled instantly, but never mounting the horse. After seeing the animal led up and down the yard once or twice, he would always find some excuse for not riding, the fact being that he had no longer courage enough to get into the saddle. His riding days were over. Even the stable mastiff, an old favourite with Brian, gave him a painful shock when the great tawny brute leapt out of his kennel, straining at his chain, and baying deep-mouthed thunder by way of a friendly greeting. Towler had a hard time of it, following his charge here and there, waiting upon him, bearing his abuse, but Towler had a peculiar gift, a faculty for getting on with patients of this kind. He knew how to dodge and follow and circumvent them, how to take liberties with them and scold them, without too deeply wounding their amour-propre, how to humour and manage them, and although Mr. Wendover quarrelled with his attendant 50 times a day, he yet liked the man and tolerated his presence, and had already come to lean upon him, and to be angry when Towler absented himself. "Well," said Brian, looking up as Ida entered his room on that happy morning on which she had been told that her brother was out of danger. "The boy is better, I hear." These things are quickly known in a household, when there has been general anxiety about the issue of an illness. "Yes, he is better. By God's grace he will live, but his life has trembled in the balance. Brian, it would have been your fault if he had died." "Would it? Yes, I suppose indirectly I should have been the cause. I was a fool to take him out that morning, but," shrugging his shoulders, "I wanted a ramble, and I wanted company. Who could tell there would be such a diabolical storm, or that we should lose our way? Thank God he is out of danger, poor little beggar." "Did you think I wanted him put out of the way?" he asked suddenly, looking at her with a keen flash of interrogation. "To think that would be to think you a murderer," she answered coldly. "I have thought that you had little affection for him or for me when you exposed him to that danger, and then I schooled myself to think better of you, to remember that perhaps on that day you were hardly responsible for your actions." "In fact, that I was a lunatic," said Brian. "I would rather think you mad than wicked." "Perhaps I am neither. Why have you put that man as a spy upon me?" The discreet Towler had retired into the adjacent bedroom during this conversation. "He is not a spy. Dr. Mallison said you ought to have a servant specially to wait upon you, that in your sleepless nights you might not be left alone." No, they are a trial, those long nights. Towler is not a bad fellow, but he irritates me sometimes. Last night he let a black-muzzled gipsy brute hide behind my curtains, and then told me it was my delusions. Delusions! When I saw the fellow as plain as I see you now." Ida was silent. She had hoped that the patient had passed this stage, and was on the road to recovery of health and reason. She interrogated Towler by and by, and he assured her that Mr. Wendover had taken no stimulants since he had been attending upon him. "Are you sure he cannot get any without your knowledge?" Ida asked. "Dr. Mallison told me that in this malady a patient is terribly artful, that he will contrive to evade the closest watchfulness, if it is any way possible to get drink." "Ah, that's true enough, ma'am," sighed the man. "There's no getting to the bottom of their artfulness. But I'm an old hand, and I know all the ins and outs of the complaint. It isn't possible for Mr. Wendover to get any drink in this house, and he never goes out of it without me. Every drop of wine and spirits is under lock and key, and all the servants are warned against giving him anything." Ida sighed, full of shame at the thought that her husband, the man whom it was her duty to honour and obey, should be degraded by such humiliating precautions, and yet there was no help for it. He had brought himself to this pass. This is the end of ambrosial nights, the feast of reason, the flow of soul, wit drowned in whisky, satire stimulated by brandy and soda. Ida went back to her brother's room. It was there her love, her fears, her cares were all concentrated. Duty might make her careful and thoughtful for her husband, but here love was paramount. To sit by his pillow, to talk to him, or read to him, or pray for him, to minister to him, jealous of the skilled nurse who had been hired to perform these offices, these things were her delight. Lady Palliser, worn out with watching and anxiety, had now broken down altogether, and had consented to take a long day's rest. But Ida's more energetic nature could do with much less rest. Half an hour's delicious sleep now and then, with her head on her darling's pillow, was all sufficient to restore her. And so the blessed days of hope went on, and every morning and every afternoon Mr. Fosbrook's report was more favourable. It was a tedious recovery from a cruel disease, happily shortened by at least 2/3 of its old-fashioned length by modern treatment. But all was going well, and the hearts of the watchers were at ease. The boy lay swathed in cotton wool, very helpless, very languid, fed and petted from morning till night, like a young bird brought up by hand, and Ida and her stepmother had to be patient and thankful. Ida had often thought during the boy's illness of the man who had found him, and brought him safely home to them on that anxious day, and she wished much to testify her gratitude to the misanthropic dweller in that gamekeeper's cottage, but she hesitated as to her manner of approaching him. To go herself would be futile, when he had so obdurately shut his door against her. Then she had Vernon's assurance that this bohemian hated women. She might have sent a servant with a message, but she had reason to know from Vernon's description of the man that he was altogether above the servant class, and would be likely to resent such a form of approach. She might have written to him, but her pride recoiled from that course, remembering his cavalier treatment of her. And so she let the days slip by until Vernon began to recover strength and good spirits, and to inquire about his friend. "I want Jack to come and see me and sit with me," said the boy. "He could come to tea, couldn't he, mother? You wouldn't mind, would you?" "My dear, he is not a proper person for you to associate with," replied Lady Palliser. "You oughtn't to demean yourself by associating with your inferiors." "Demean fiddlesticks!" cried Vernie. "I don't believe there is such a word. Jack is the cleverest man I know, cleverer than Mr. Jardine, and that's saying a great deal." Vainly did the widow endeavour to awaken her son's mind to the great gulf which divides a baronet from a hawker. a gulf not to be bridged over by the genius of a Dalton or a Whewell, and to those nice distinctions which obtain between a casual out-of-door intercourse with a man of this class and a deliberate invitation to tea. "When I'm well enough to go out, I can go to him," answered Vernon, doggedly. "But now I'm ill he must come to me, and it's very unkind of you not to let him come. Blow his station in life! If he was a duke, I shouldn't want him." "I can't think what you want with this low person, when Ida and I are always doing everything to amuse you," moaned Lady Palliser. "Ida's a darling, and you too, mother," said the boy, putting his thin arms round his mother's neck. He was now just able to move those poor arms, which had been so racked with pain a little while ago. "But I get tired of everything, Shakespeare, Dickens even. It's so long to stay in bed, and I think Jack would amuse me more than anyone, if you'd let him come." "He shall come, darling. Is there anything I could refuse you?" said the mother, eagerly, moved by the sight of tears in Vernon's innocent blue eyes. "Ask him to come to tea this afternoon." "Yes, love, I'll go and see about it this minute." Lady Palliser went in quest of Ida, who was sitting in Brian's study reading, while her husband wrote, or made believe to write, at a table in the window piled with books of reference, which he consulted every now and then, lolling back in his chair and reading listlessly, altogether a mere show and pretence of study, never likely to result in anything, a weary dawdling away of the long summer morning. To Ida, Lady Palliser explained her difficulty. A note of some kind must be written to this Cheap Jack, and the little woman did not know how to word that note. "If I say, 'Lady Palliser presents her compliments to Mr. Cheap Jack, and requests the pleasure of his company,' it seems like I'm putting myself on a level with him, don't you know? I wish you'd write it for me, Ida." "Willingly, dear mother, but I'm afraid the man won't come. He is such a very rough diamond." "Oh, but surely he will be gratified at an invitation to tea." "I'm afraid not. But I'll write at once. Anything to please Vernon." Ida wrote as follows: "Sir Vernon Palliser, who is slowly recovering from a serious illness, will be very pleased if his friend Jack will spend an hour or two with him this afternoon. Any hour convenient to Jack will be agreeable to Sir Vernon, but he would much like Jack to drink tea with him between 4 and 5. The other members of the family will not intrude upon the sick room while Jack is there." "I think that will do," said Ida, and Lady Palliser carried off the note, wondering at her stepdaughter's cleverness, yet inclined to fear that the hermit of Blackman's Hanger might be offended at being addressed as Jack, tout court. And yet how could one deal ceremoniously with a man who acknowledged no surname, and was known to all the neighbourhood only as Cheap Jack? Mr. Fosbrook came for his noontide visit just after this business of the letter, and found Ida and her stepmother both with the invalid. He was told what they had done. "Do you think he'll come?" Vernon asked eagerly. "I should think he would, Sir Vernon," answered the doctor, "for I know he takes a keen interest in your recovery. All the time you were really bad he used to hang about the park gate every day as I went out, and stopped me to ask how you were. And he asked after you too, Mrs. Wendover. Seemed to be afraid your anxiety about this little man would be too much for you." "Remarkably polite of him," said Ida, laughing. "Yet he treated me in the most bearish manner when I went to his cottage." "If he is a bear, he is a bear with gentlemanly instincts," replied the doctor. "Nothing could be more respectful, more delicate, than his inquiries about you, and I could see by the expression of his eyes that he really felt for you. He has very fine eyes." "One of the tokens of his gipsy blood, I suppose," said Ida. "Yes, I believe he is a gipsy. They are a keen-witted race." "A gipsy, with so much plate as there is in this house!" exclaimed Lady Palliser. "Oh, Vernie, You ought not to have asked me to ask him." "Don't be afraid, mother," said Ida. "He'll be sharply looked after, if he does come." "Looked after, indeed! Why, you might give him the run of a silver mine. What does he care for your trumpery silver spoons?" cried Vernon contemptuously. The invalid was doomed to disappointment. About 2 hours after Ida's letter had been dispatched, a small boy brought Cheap Jack's reply, to the following effect: "Jack is very sorry he cannot drink tea with his little friend." "Little friend, indeed! What vulgar familiarity!" exclaimed Lady Palliser. "But he belongs to the dwellers in tents, and would be out of place in a fine house." "Then he is a gipsy," said Lady Palliser. "What a luck! Escape!" "He looks forward to the pleasure of seeing Sir Vernon on the hanger before long. Meanwhile he can only send his duty and best wishes for Sir Vernon's speedy recovery." "The end is a little better than the commencement," said Lady Palliser, "but I call it a great liberty for Cheap Jack to talk of my son as his little friend." "He might have left out little, considering that I shall be 12 next birthday," said Vernon with dignity. "But I am his friend, mother, and I mean to be his friend always. And when I am grown up I shall take him to the Rocky Mountains, and we will hunt moose and things." Lady Palliser sighed, and hoped that this passion for low company would pass with the other follies of childhood. Now that all danger was past, and that Vernon was on the high road to health, Ida spent the greater part of her time in attendance upon her husband. It was her duty, she told herself, and she who had so failed in love must needs fulfil every duty. But the performance of this simple, wifely duty of attendance on an invalid husband was fraught with pain. His temper was so irritable, his mind was so weak, his whole being so degraded and sunk by his infirmity, that the progress of his decay was, of all forms of dissolution, the most painful for the looker on. That he was sinking into a lower depth of degradation, rather than recovering, was sadly obvious to Ida, in spite of occasional intervals of better feeling and rare flashes of his old brightness. The case was altogether perplexing. Towler admitted that he was more puzzled than he had ever been about any patient whom he had enjoyed the honour of attending. Mr. Wendover, under his present conditions of absolute sobriety, and with youth on his side, ought to have shown a decided improvement by this time, and yet there was no substantial amelioration of his state, and his latest fit of the horrors, which occurred only a night ago, had been quite as bad as the first which Towler had witnessed. "You do not think that he gets brandy without your knowledge?" inquired Ida, blushing at the question. "No, ma'am, I'm too careful for that. I've searched his trunks even, and every cupboard in his rooms, and I've looked behind the registers of the stoves, which are very handy places for patients hiding bottles in the summer time, but there's not so much as an ounce phial. And Mr. Wendover's hardly out of my sight, except when he takes his bath, or just going in and out of his bathroom, where he keeps his pipes, as you know, ma'am. Besides, even if he had any hiding place for drink, who was likely to supply him with it?" "No, I hope there is no one," said Ida thoughtfully. "I hope no one in this house would so betray my confidence. I've taken stock of all the servants, ma'am, and I don't think there's one that would do it." Ida was of the same opinion. The servants were old servants, as loyal to the heads of the house as a Highland clan to their chief. Sunday came, a peaceful summer Sabbath, a day of sunshine and azure sky, and Ida, whose anxiety about Vernon had kept her away from her parish church for the last 3 Sundays, was able to set out upon her walk to the village with a heart quite at rest on the boy's account. Even the mother could find no excuse for staying at home with her boy, and felt that conscience and society alike required that she should assist at the service of her parish church. Vernie was convalescent, able to sit up in his bed, propped with pillows, and eat hothouse grapes, and turn over the leaves of endless volumes of Punch, laughing with his hearty childish laugh at Leech's jokes and the curious garments of a departed era. How could men wear such trousers? And how could women wear such bonnets? He asked his mother, wonderingly contemplating fashionable youth as represented by the great pen-and-ink humorist. "I don't know why we shouldn't wear them, Vernie," said his mother, with a rather offended air. "Those spoon bonnets were very becoming. I wore one the day your pa first saw me." "And hoops under your gown like that?" said Vernie, pointing. "And those funny little boots? What a guy you must have looked!" When a boy has come to this pass, he may fairly be left with the servants for a couple of hours. So Lady Palliser put on her stateliest mourning, her thick corded silk flounced with crape, and her Mary Stuart bonnet, and went across the park, and up hill and down hill, for it was a country of hills and hollows, to the parish church of Wimperfield, a very ancient edifice, with massive columnar piers, Norman-groined roof, and walls enriched by a grand array of memorial tablets, setting forth the honours and virtues of those dead and gone Landovers whose bones were mouldering in the vaults below the square oaken pews in which the living worshipped. In the chancel there was the usual stately monument to some magnate of the Middle Ages, who was represented kneeling by his wife's side, with a graduated row of sons and daughters kneeling behind them, as if the whole family had died and petrified simultaneously in the act of pious worship. Ida did not invite her husband to join her in the Sabbath devotions, assured that he would claim an invalid's privilege to stay at home. He had very rarely attended the parish church with his wife, affecting to despise such humdrum and conventional worship. He had just that thin smattering of modern science which enables shallow youth to make a merit of disbelief in all things beyond the limit of mathematical demonstration. He had skimmed Darwin, and spoke lightly of mankind as the latest development of time and matter, and no higher a being, from a spiritual point of view, than the first worm that wriggled in its primeval slime. He had dipped into Herbert Spencer, and talked largely of God as the unknowable, and how could the unknowable be supposed to take pleasure in the automatic prayers of a handful of bumpkins and clodhoppers met together in a mouldy old church, time out of mind the temple of superstitions and ceremonies. The vast temple of the universe was Brian Walford's idea of a church, and a very fine church it is, if a man will only worship faithfully therein. But the man who abandons formal prayers and set seasons of devotion with a vague idea of worshipping in the woodland or on the hilltop very rarely troubles himself to realize his ideal. Brian's broadly declared agnosticism had long been a cause of pain and grief to his wife. She had felt that this alone would have made sympathy impossible between them, had there been no other ground for difference. She thought with a bitter sense of contrast of his cousin, who was a student and a thinker, and yet was not ashamed to believe and to worship as a little child. Surely it was not a sign of a weak intelligence for a man to believe in something better and higher than himself, when Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and Virgil could so believe. Brian Walford's idea of cleverness was to consider himself the ultimate product of incalculable antecedent time, the full stop of creation. Here were all the pious parishioners, the country families, and the country bumpkins, meekly kneeling on their knees and uplifting their voices in perfect faithfulness, not thinking very deeply of any element in the service, perhaps, but honest in their reverence and their love. The old church was a pretty sight on such a summer morning, the white robes of the choristers touched with supernal radiance, the light tempered by the deep rubies and purples and ambers in windows old and new, the very irregularities and architectural anomalies of the building producing a quaintness which was more pleasing than absolute beauty. The litany was nearly over when Ida heard a familiar step on the stone pavement of the nave. It was Brian's step, and presently he stopped at the door of the high oaken pew, opened it, and came in and seated himself on the bench, opposite to the spot where she knelt by her stepmother's side. It was a capacious old pew, and would have held 10 people. Brian kicked about the hassocks and made himself comfortable, but he did not kneel or take any part in the service. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands, staring at the floor. His presence filled Ida with anxiety. He had not risen from his bed when she left home, and Towler had given her to understand that he would not get up for some time, as he had had a very bad night. He must have risen and dressed hurriedly in order to follow her to church. His eyes had the wild look in them which she had noticed on the night when he saw visions. It was in vain that Ida tried after this to fix her mind upon the service. Every movement, every look of Brian's alarmed her. She was thankful for the high pew, which sheltered him from the gaze of the congregation, and presently, when they stood up to sing a hymn, she was glad that Brian remained seated, albeit there was irreverence in the attitude. But when the last verse was being sung, he rose suddenly and looked all around the church with those wild eyes of his, took up a book and turned the leaves abstractedly, and remained standing like a sleep-walker for a minute or so, after the congregation had gone down on their knees for the communion service. When the gospel was read, he rose again, and lolled with his back against the plastered wall, his head just under a winged cherub head in marble, which adorned the base of a memorial tablet. This time he stood till all the service was over, so obviously apart from all the rest of the congregation, so evidently uninterested in anything that was going on, that Ida felt as if every eye must be watching him, every creature in the church conscious of his infirmity. He was carelessly dressed, his collar awry, his necktie loose, his hair unbrushed. His very appearance was a disgrace, which Lady Palliser, whose great object in life was to maintain her dignity before the eyes of the county families, felt could hardly be lived down in the future. The pale, haggard countenance, those bloodshot, wandering eyes, surely every creature in the church must know that they meant brandy. The sermon began, one of those orthodox, old-fashioned, dry-as-dust sermons often heard in village churches, a discourse which sets out with a small point in Bible history, not having any obvious bearing upon modern thought or modern life, and discusses and explains and enlarges upon it with deliberate scholarship for about half an hour, and then, in a brisk 5 minutes, endeavours to show how the conduct of Ahab, or Jehoram, or Isaiah, in this little matter, was an exact counterpart, or paradigm, of our conduct, my dear brethren, when we, etc., etc. The vicar had not arrived at this point, but was still expatiating upon the unbridled wickedness of Jehoram, when Brian, who after a period of alarming restlessness had been sitting like a statue for the last few minutes, suddenly started up and exclaimed wildly, "I can't endure it a moment longer! The stench of corruption, the dead rotting in their graves, the horrid nauseous odour of grave clothes, the foul stink of earthworms! How can you bear it? You must have no feeling. You must be made of stone." Ida and her stepmother had both risen. Each in her way was trying to soothe him, to quiet him, to induce him to sit down again. The vicar had stopped in his discourse, scared by that other voice, but Brian's loud accents sank into mutterings as he took up the thread of his argument, and went on denouncing Jehoram. "Brian, indeed there is nothing, no bad odour here." "Yes, there is the stench of death," he protested, staring at the ground, and then, pointing with a convulsive movement of his wasted hand, he cried, "Don't you see? Under that seat there, the worms crawling up through the rotten flooring. There! 50, 100, legion! For God's sake, get me out of this charnel house. I can hear the dry bones rattle as the worms swarm out of the mouldering coffins." His deadly pallor, his countenance convulsed with disgust, showed how real this horror was to him. Ida put her hand through his arm, and led him quietly away, out of the stony church into the glow of the summer noontide. He sank exhausted upon a grassy mound in the churchyard, a village child's grave, with the rose wreath which loving hands had woven fading above the sod. "How can you sit in such a vault?" he asked. "How can you live in such foul air?" "Indeed, dear Brian, it is only fancy. There is nothing amiss." "There is everything amiss. Death is everywhere. We begin to die directly we are born. Life is a descending scale of decay. We rot and rot and rot as we walk about the world pretending to be alive. First, a man loses his teeth, and then his hair, and then he looks in the glass and sees himself withered and haggard and wrinkled, and knows that the skeleton's clutch is upon him. I tell you, we are always dying. Why go to that vault yonder," pointing to the church, "to breathe the consecrated essence of mortality?" "It is good for us to remember the dead when we worship God, Brian. He is the God of the dead as well as the living. There is nothing terrible in death if we believe." "If we believe! If! The whole future is an if. The future! What future can there be for us? We came from nothing, we go back to nothing. We are resolved into the elements which renew the earth for newcomers. The wheel of progress is always revolving. For the mass there is eternity, infinity, no beginning, no end. But for the individual, his little span of life begins and ends in corruption." The sound of the organ, and the fresh rustic voices singing a familiar hymn, told Ida that the sermon was over. Lady Palliser was in an agony of anxiety to get Brian away before the congregation came out. She and Ida contrived to beguile him out of the churchyard and away towards Wimperfield Park, by a meadow path which was but little frequented. He grew more rational as they walked home, but talked and argued all the way with that semi-hysterical garrulity which was so painful to his hearers. They found Vernon sitting up in bed, reading Grimm's Goblins, and in very high spirits. A most wonderful event had happened. Cheap Jack had been to see him. He came with Mr. Fosbrook at 12 o'clock. He had overtaken Mr. Fosbrook in the park, and had asked him leave to go up to the house with him, just for a peep at his patient. "He only stayed a quarter of an hour," said Vernie, "for old Foss was in a hurry, but it was such fun. He made me laugh all the time, and Foss laughed too. He couldn't help it, and he said Jack's funny talk was better for me now than all the medicine in his surgery. And I am to get up for an hour or two this afternoon, and I am to have some chicken and as much asparagus as ever I can eat, and in less than a week I shall be able to go up to the hangar and see Jack." "My darling, you will have to be much stronger first," said Ida. "Oh, but I am very strong now. Ah, there's Brian," as his brother-in-law looked in at the door. "What a time since you've been to see me. You've been ill too, mother said. Come in, Brian. Don't mind about giving me a bad cold that day. It wasn't your fault." Brian came into the room with a hang-dog look and sat by the boy's bed. "Yes, it was my fault, Vernie. I am a wretched creature. Everything that I do ends badly. I didn't mean to do you any harm." "Of course not. You thought it was fun, and so did I, till I got tired and hungry. But those men who were chasing you—" "There were no men, were there? I didn't see any," said the boy, with his clear blue eyes on Brian's haggard face. "Yes, they were there, dodging behind the trees. I saw them plain enough," answered Brian moodily. "It was about that business I told you of. No, I couldn't tell you. It was not a thing to tell a child. A shameful accusation, but I have given them the slip." "Brian," said Ida, laying her hand on his shoulder, "why do you say these things? You know you are talking nonsense." "Am I?" he muttered, cowering as he looked up at her. "Well, it's as likely as not. Ta-ta, Vernie, you're as well as ever you were. It is I who am booked for a coffin." He went away with his feeble, shuffling steps, so unlike the step of youth. Ida followed him, thinking sadly of the autumn afternoons when he used to come leaping out of his boat, young, bright, and seemingly full of life and energy, and when she half believed she loved him. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. John Jardine solves the mystery. The Jardines came the next day, self-invited guests. Ida had tried to prevent any such visit in her desire to keep her husband's degradation from the knowledge of his kindred. But Bessie was not to be so put off. She had heard that Brian was ill, and that Vernon had been dangerously ill, and her heart overflowed with love and compassion for her friend. It was not easy for Mr. Jardine to leave his parish, but he would have done a more difficult thing rather than see his wife unhappy. So on the Monday morning, after the scene in church, Ida received a telegram to say that Mr. and Mrs. Jardine were going to drive over to see her, and that they would claim her hospitality for a couple of days. It was a drive of over 30 miles, only to be done by a merciful man between sunrise and sunset. Mr. and Mrs. Jardine started at 5 o'clock, breakfasted and lunched on the road, and brought their faithful steed, Drummer Boy, up to the Wimperfield portico at 7 in the evening, with not a hair turned. Ida was waiting for them in the portico. "My darling, how pale and worried you look!" exclaimed Bessie, as she hugged her friend. "And why didn't you let me come before?" "You could have done me no good, dear, when my troubles were at the worst. Thank God the worst is over now. Vernie is getting on splendidly. He was downstairs today and ate such a dinner. We were quite afraid he would bring on a relapse from overeating. He is delighted at the idea of seeing you and Mr. Jardine." "Has he gone to bed? I'll go up and see him at once, if I may," said John Jardine. "He is in his own room. He asked to stop up till 7 on purpose to see you." "Then I'll go to him this instant." The luggage had been brought out of the light tea-cart, and the drummer boy had been led round to the stables. Ida took Bessie to a room at the end of the house, remote from Brian's apartments. "Why, this isn't our usual room," said Bessie, astonished. "No, I thought this would be a pleasanter room in such warm weather. It looks east," Ida answered, rather feebly. It's a very nice room, only I felt more at home in the other. I've occupied it so often, you know. I felt almost as if it were my own. Oh, you cruel girl, why didn't you let me come sooner? I wanted so to be with you in your trouble, and I offered to come directly I heard Vernie was ill." "I know, dear, but you could have done no good. We were in God's hands. We could only pray and wait. Love can always do good. I could have comforted you." "Nothing could have comforted me if he died." "And Brian! Poor Brian has been ill too. I thought him very much changed when we were here. So thin, so nervous, so depressed." "Yes, he was ill then. He is very ill now. We take all the care we can of him, but he doesn't get any better." "Poor dear Brian! And he was once the soul of fun and gaiety. Used to sing comic songs so capitally. I suppose it is a poor thing for a man to do, but it was very nice, especially at Christmas time. There are so few people who can do anything to help one over Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Brian was good at everything, charades, clumps, consequences, dumb crambo. And to think that he should be ill so long. What is his complaint, Ida? Asked Bessie, suddenly becoming earnest after a lapse into childishness. It is a nervous complaint, faltered Ida. He will soon get over it, I hope and believe, if we take proper care of him. He is very excitable, very unlike his old self, and you must not be astonished at anything he may say or do. You don't mean that he is out of his mind? Said Bessie, with an awe-stricken look. No, no, nothing of the kind, at least, nothing that is likely to be lasting. But he has delusions sometimes, a kind of hysterical affection. Oh, Bessie, I did not want you to know anything. I tried to keep you away. Bessie had her arms round her old friend, and Ida, quite broken down by the fears and agitations of the last 6 weeks, hid her face upon Mrs. Jardine's shoulder and sobbed aloud. It was a complete collapse of heroic resolutions, of that unflinching courage and strength of mind which had sustained her so long, but it was also a blessed relief to the overcharged heart and brain. "It is very selfish of me to plague you with my troubles," she said, when Bessie had kissed and comforted her with every expression of sympathy and tenderness in the gamut of womanly love. "But I wanted you to be prepared for the worst. And now let me help you change your gown, if you are going to make any change for dinner. The gong will sound in less than half an hour." "Oh, those gongs! They always fill me with despair," cried Bess. "I am never ready when ours begins to buzz through the house, like a gigantic, melancholy, mad bumblebee. Of course I must change, dear. Firstly, because I am smothered with dust, and sixthly, as Dogberry says, because I have brought a pretty gown to do honour to Wimperfield." And Bessie, rushing to her portmanteau, and tearing out its contents in a frantic way, shook out the laces and ribbons of a gracious Watteau-like arrangement in Madras muslin, while she chattered to her hostess. "Shall I send for Jane Dyson?" The immaculate maid, who had lived with an archbishop's wife. "She can unpack your things." "Not for worlds. I have oceans to tell you, and I should hate that prim personage looking on and listening." "Such news, Ida. Urania is engaged." "At last!" That was what everybody said. This was her 6th season, and it was rapidly becoming a case of real distress, and she was getting blue, to a frightful extent. A perambulatory epitome of Huxley cum Darwin. That's what our boys call her. And now, after refusing ever so many nice young men in the government offices because they were not rich enough for her, she is going to make a great match and marry a nasty old man. "Oh, Bessie, nasty and old?" "Strong language, isn't it? But the gentleman has been to Kingthorpe, and there is no doubt about the fact. One wouldn't mind his being elderly if he were only a gentleman, but he is not." "Then why in mercy's name does Miss Rylance marry him?" "Because he is Sir Tobias Vandilk, one of the richest men on the Stock Exchange. He is of Dutch extraction, they say, and this is supposed to account for his utter destitution with regard to English aspirates. He has a palace in Park Lane, and a park in Yorkshire, and gives dinners of the most recherché description every Thursday in the season, and immense shooting parties, at which I am told he and his friends slaughter quintillions of pheasants, and flood the London market every autumn. And it's whispered that he has lent money to royal personages." "Is Urania happy?" "If she is not, I know who is. Dr. Rylance looks 20 years younger since the engagement. He was beginning to get weighed down by Urania. You remember with what a firm hand he managed her in days gone by? Well, after she took to Huxley and Darwin, and the rest of them, that was all over. She was always tripping him up with some little shred of scientific knowledge, fresh from Tyndall, always attacking his old-fashioned notions with some new light. He was as merry as a boy let loose from school when he came down to Kingthorpe the other day. He went to one of our picnics and made himself tremendously agreeable. We took Sir Tobias to see the Abbey and had afternoon tea there. He pretended to admire everything, but in a patronizing way that made me savage. Affected to think Wendover Abbey a little bit of a place, as compared with his modern barrack in Yorkshire, with its riding school, tan gallop, range of orchard houses, picture gallery, and so on. And Urania's grandeur is something too large for words. "You and Mr. Jardine must come and stay with us at Hanborough some day," she said, as if she were promising me a treat. So I told her plainly that my husband's parish work made such a visit impossible. "Oh, but some day," she said sweetly. "Never," said I. "We are rooted in the chalk of Salisbury Plain." "Poor things," she sighed. "What a destiny!" "And you all drank tea at the Abbey," said Ida musingly. "Dear old Abbey. I can fancy you there in the long, low library, with the afternoon sunlight shining in at the open windows, and Mary Stuart smiling at you from the panelling over one fireplace, and crafty Elizabeth looking sideways at you from over the other, and the Dijon roses clambering and twining round every lattice. How well you remember the old place! Isn't it horrid of Brian to stay away all these years? It is rather eccentric." "Eccentric? It is positively wicked, when we know how agreeable he can make himself. Why, in that happy summer we spent at the Abbey, he brightened all our lives. Didn't he now, Ida?" "He was very kind," faltered Ida, like a slave giving evidence under torture. "Have you heard from him lately?" "Not for more than a year, but father hears of him through his London agent, and we know he is well. He sent us all lovely presents last Christmas. Indian shawls, prayer rugs, ivories, carved sandalwood boxes. The vicarage is glorified by his gifts." The gong began booming and buzzing as Bessie pinned a big yellow rose among the folds of her Madras fichu, and Mrs. Jardine and her hostess went down to the drawing-room lovingly, arms entwined, as in that long-ago holiday when Ida was a guest at Kingthorpe. Lady Palliser and Mr. Jardine were in the drawing-room talking to each other, while Brian paced up and down the room, pale and wan, as he had looked yesterday in the church. He offered his arm to Bessie at his wife's bidding, without a word. Mr. Jardine followed, with Lady Palliser and Ida, and the little party of 5 sat down to dinner with a blight upon them, the awful shadow of domestic misery. There are many such dinners eaten every day in England, than which the Barmecide's was a more cheerful feast, a red herring and bread and butter in a garret, a banquet of sweeter savour. For the first 2 courses Brian preserved a sullen silence. He ate nothing, did not even pretend to eat, and drank the sherry and soda water which were offered to him without comment. With the 3rd course the butler, who had supplied him with the prescribed amount of sherry, gave him plain soda water. He looked at his tumbler for a moment or so, and burst out laughing. "Byron used to drink soda water at dinners when he was the rage in London society," he said. "It was chic, and Byron was like Sarah Bernhardt. He would have done anything to get himself talked about. I should have thought the fame he won by Childe Harold would have satisfied him, without any outside notoriety as a total abstainer," said Mr. Jardine. "Oh, if you think that, you don't know Byron," exclaimed Brian. "He wanted people always to be talking of him. A man may write the greatest book that was ever written, and the world will accept it and put him on a pinnacle, but they soon leave off talking about him unless he does something. He must keep a bear in his rooms, quarrel with his wife, wear a pea-green overcoat, cross the Channel in a balloon, and go on doing queer things, if he wants to be famous. Byron was adept in the art of réclame, just as Whistler is on his smaller scale. It wasn't enough for Byron to be the greatest poet of modern Europe. He wanted to be the most notorious rake and roue into the bargain." "It was a curious nature," said Mr. Jardine, "half gold and half tinsel." "Ah, but the tinsel caught the public. I really don't think, for a man who wants to make a stir in his generation, a fellow could have played his cards better than Byron did." It is a life that one can only contemplate with infinite pity and regret, a great nature wrecked by small vices and smaller follies, said Mr. Jardine. And then Brian took up the strain, and talked with loud assertiveness of the right of genius to do what it likes in the world, launching out into a broad declaration of infidelity and rank materialism, which shocked and scared the three women who heard him. Ida gave an imploring look at her stepmother, and they all three rose simultaneously and hastily retired, driven away by that blatant blasphemy. John Jardine closed the door upon the ladies, and then went quietly back to his seat. He heard all that Brian had to say, he listened to his wild ramblings as to the voice of an oracle, and then, when Brian had poured out his little stock of argument in favour of materialism, had quoted Aristotle, and Holbach, and Hume, and Comte, and Darwin, and had perverted their arguments against a personal God into the divine right of man to ruin his soul and body, John Jardine, who had read more of Aristotle than Brian knew of all the metaphysicians put together, and who had Plato, Kant, and Douglas Stewart in his heart of hearts, gravely took up the strain and made mincemeat of Mr. Wendover's philosophy. Brian listened meekly, and did not appear to take offence when the vicar went on to warn him against the peril here and hereafter of a life misspelt, a constitution ruined by self-indulgence, talents unused, opportunities neglected. The pale and haggard wretch sat cowering, as the voice of reproof and warning went on, solemnly, earnestly, with the warm sympathy which springs from perfect pity, from the Christian's wide love of his fellow-man. "For your wife's, for your own sake, for the love of him in whose image you were made, wrestle with the devil that possesses you," said John Jardine, when they had risen to leave the room, laying his hand affectionately upon Brian's shoulder. "Believe me, victory is possible." "Not now," Brian answered, with a semi-hysterical laugh. "It is too late. There comes an hour, you know, even in your all-merciful creed, when the door is shut. Too late, you cannot enter now. The door is shut upon me. I fooled my life away in London. It was pleasant enough while it lasted, but it's over now. I can say with Cleopatra, 'Oh, my life in Egypt! Oh, the dalliance and the wit!'" They were in the hall by this time. The broad marble-paved hall, with its marble figures of gods and goddesses, of which nobody ever took any more notice than if they had been umbrella-stands. They were crossing the hall on their way to the drawing-room, when Brian suddenly clutched John Jardine's arm, and reeled heavily against him, with an appalling cry. "Hold me!" he screamed. "Hold me! I am going down!" It was one of the dreadful symptoms of his dreaded disease. All at once, with the solid black and white marble beneath his feet, he felt himself upon the edge of a precipice, felt himself falling, falling, falling into a bottomless pit. It was an awful feeling, a waking nightmare. He sank exhausted into John Jardine's arms, panting for breath. "You are safe. It is only a momentary delusion," said Mr. Jardine. "Have you had that feeling often before?" "Yes, sometimes. Pretty often," gasped Brian. Mr. Jardine's wide reading and large experience as a parish priest had made him half a doctor. He knew that this was one of the symptoms of delirium tremens, and a symptom seen mostly in cases of a dangerous type. He had suspected the nature of Mr. Wendover's disease before now, but now he was certain of it. He went with Brian to his room, advising him to lie down and rest. Brian appearing consentient, Mr. Jardine left him, with Towler in attendance. In the drawing-room the vicar contrived to get a little quiet talk with Ida, while at the other end of the room Lady Palliser was expatiating to Bessie upon the minutest details of her boy's illness. He invited Ida's confidence, and frankly told her that he fathomed the nature of Brian's disease. "I have seen too many cases in the course of my parochial experience not to recognize the painful symptoms. I am so sorry for you and for him. It is a bright young life thrown away." "Do you think he will not recover?" "I think it is a very bad case. He is wasted to a shadow, and has a worn, haggard look that I don't like. And then he has those painful hallucinations, the idea of falling down a precipice, for instance, which are oftenest seen in fatal cases." Ida told him of the scene in the church yesterday. She confided in him fully, telling him all that Dr. Mallison had said of the case. "What can I do?" she asked, piteously. "I don't think you can do more than you are doing. That man who waits upon your husband is a nurse, I suppose?" "Yes, Dr. Mallison sent him." "And care is taken that the patient gets no stimulants supplied to him?" "Every care, and yet—" "And yet what?" "I have a suspicion, and I think Towler suspects too, that Brian does get brandy somehow." "But how can that be, if your servants are honest, and this attendant is to be depended upon?" "I can't tell you. I believe the servants are incapable of deceiving me. Towler, the attendant, comes to us with the highest character." "Well, I will be on the alert while I am with you," said Mr. Jardine, and Ida felt as if he were a tower of strength. "I have seen these sad cases, and had to do with them only too often. On some occasions I have been happy enough to be the means of saving a man from his own folly." "Pray stop as long as you can with us, and do all you can," entreated Ida. "I wish I had asked you to come sooner, only I was so ashamed for him, poor creature. I thought it would be a wrong to him to let anyone know how low he had fallen." "It is part of my office to know how low humanity can fall and yet be raised up again," said Mr. Jardine. "You won't tell Bessie? She would be so grieved for her cousin." "I will tell her nothing more than she can find out herself, but you know she is very quick-witted." There was a change for the worse in Towler's charge next morning, when Ida, who still occupied the room adjoining her husband's bedchamber, went in at 8 o'clock to inquire how he had passed the night. Brian was up, half-dressed, pacing up and down the room and talking incoherently. He had been up ever since 5 o'clock, Towler said, but it was impossible to get him to dress himself, or suffer himself to be dressed. A frightful restlessness had taken possession of him, more intense than any previous restlessness, and it was impossible to do anything for him. His hallucinations since daybreak had taken a frightful form. He had seen poisonous snakes gliding in and out of the folds of his bedclothes, and he fancied every kind of hideous monster, the winged reptiles of the Jura formation, the armour-plated fish of the old red sandstone, everything that is grotesque, revolting, terrible, skeletons, poison-spitting toads, vampires, werewolves, flying cats. They had all lurked amidst the draperies of bed or windows, or grinned at him through the panes of the glass. "Look!" he shrieked, as Ida approached him, soothing, pleading in gentlest accents. "Look! Don't you see them?" he cried, pointing to the shapes that seemed to people the room, and trying to push them aside with a restless motion of his hands. "Don't you see them? The lairs and the lemurs? Look, there is Cleopatra, with the asp at her breast. That bosom was once beautiful, and see now what a loathsome spectacle death has made it. The very worms recoil from that corruption. See, there is Canidia, the sorceress, who buried the boy alive. Look at her hair flying loose about her head. Hair? No, those locks are living vipers. And Sagana, with hair erect, like the bristles of a wild boar. See, Ida, how she rushes about, sprinkling the room with water from the rivers of hell. And Villa, whose cruel heart never felt remorse. Yes, he knew them well, Horace. These furies were the women he had loved and wooed. Fancies, memories flitted across his disordered brain, swift as lightning flashes. In a moment, Canidia was forgotten, and he was Pentheus, struggling with Agave and her demented crew. They were tearing him to pieces. Their fingers were at his throat. Then he was in the East, a defenseless traveller in the tropical desert, surrounded by thugs. He pointed to one particular spot where he saw his insidious foe. He described the dusky, supple figure, the sinuous limbs, gliding serpent-like towards him, the oiled body, the dagger in the uplifted hand. An illustration in Sir Charles Bell's classic treatise had flashed into his brain. So from memory to memory, with a frightful fertility of fancy, his unresting brain hurried on, while his wife could only watch and listen, tortured by an agony greater than his own. To look on, and to be powerless to afford the slightest help, was dreadful. Up and down, and round about the room he wandered, talking perpetually waving aside the horrid images which pursued and appalled him, his eyeballs in constant motion, the pupils dilated, his hollow cheeks deadly pale, his face bathed in perspiration. "Send for Mr. Fosbrook," said Ida, speaking on the threshold of the adjoining room, to the maid who brought her letters. And in the midst of his distraction, Brian's quick ear caught the name. "Fosbrook, me no Fosbrooks," he said. "I will have no village apothecaries diagnosing my disease, no ignorant quack telling me how to treat myself." "I will telegraph for Dr. Mallison if you like, Brian," Ida answered gently. "But I know Mr. Fosbrook is a clever man, and he perfectly understands—" "Yes, he will have the audacity to tell you he knows what is the matter with me. He will say this is delirium tremens, a lie, and you must know it is a lie." To her infinite relief, Mr. Jardine appeared at this moment. He questioned Towler as to the possibility of tranquilizing his patient, and he found that the sedatives prescribed by Dr. Mallison had ceased to exercise any beneficial effect. Nights of insomnia and restlessness had been the rule with the patient ever since Towler had been in attendance upon him. "I never knew such a brain, or such invention," exclaimed Towler. "The people and the places and the things he talks about is enough to make a man's hair stand on end." "The natural result of a vivid memory, and a good deal of desultory reading. Most patients takes an idea and harps upon it," said Towler. "It is the multiplication table, or the Day of Judgment, or the volcanoes and hot springs, and what you may call 'ems, in the centre of the earth, and they'll go on over and over again, always coming back to the same point, like a merry-go-round. But this one is quite different. There's no bound to his delusions. We're at the North Pole one minute and digging up diamonds in Africa the next." Brian had flung himself upon his bed, rolled in the damask curtain, like Henry Plantagenet. This time he went off into one of his fury fits about Thomas Becket, and Mr. Jardine and Towler were able to talk confidentially at a respectful distance. "Are you sure that he does not get brandy without your knowledge?" "No, sir," said Towler. "That is what I am not sure about. It's a puzzling case. He didn't ought to be so bad as he is after my care of him. There ought to be some improvement by this time, instead of which it's all the other way." "What precautions have you taken?" "I've searched his rooms, and not a thing have I found stowed away anywhere. It isn't often that he's left to himself, for when I get my midday sleep Mrs. Wendover sits with him, or if he's cranky and wants to be alone, she stays in the next room with the door ajar between them, and Robert, the groom, is on duty in the passage in case the patient should get unmanageable." "I see. You have been very careful, but practically your patient has been often alone. The half-open door signifies nothing. He was unobserved and free to do what he pleased all the time." But he couldn't drink if there were no liquor within his reach. Was there none? That is the question, answered Mr. Jardine. Look about the rooms yourself, sir, and see if he could hide anything, except in such places as I have overhauled every morning, said Towler, with an offended air, and then, swelling with outraged dignity, he flung open the doors of wardrobes and closets, pulled out drawers, and otherwise demonstrated the impossibility of anything remaining secret from his eagle eye. What about the next room? Asked Mr. Jardine, going into the adjoining room, which was Brian's study. The room was littered with books and papers heaped untidily upon tables and chairs, and even strewn upon the carpet. Brian had objected to any attempt at setting this apartment in order. The servants were to leave all books and papers untouched, on pain of his severe displeasure. Thus everything in the shape of litter had been allowed to accumulate, with its natural accompaniment, dust. Everyone knows the hideous confusion which the daily and weekly newspapers alone can make in a room if left unsorted and unarranged for a month or so. And mixed with these there were pamphlets, magazines, manuscripts, and piles of more solid literature in the shape of books brought up from the library for reference and consultation. In one corner there were a pile of empty boxes, and on one of these Mr. Jardine's eye lighted instantly, on account of its resemblance to a wine merchant's case. He pulled this box out from the others, a plain deal box, roughly finished, just the size of a 2-dozen case. One label had been pulled off, but there was a railway label which gave the date of delivery, just 3 weeks back. "Have you any idea what this box contained?" inquired Mr. Jardine. "No, sir. It was here when I came, just as you see it now. It looks very like a wine merchant's box." "Well, it might be a wine case, sir, as far as the look of it, but it might have held anything. It was empty when I came here, and there's no stowage for wine bottles in these rooms, as you have seen with your own eyes." "Don't be too sure of that. Now go back to your patient and get him to eat some breakfast if you can, while I go downstairs. He can't eat, sir. It's pitiful. He don't eat enough for a robin. We try to keep up his strength with strong soups and such like, but it's hard work to get him to swallow anything." Mr. Jardine went down to the family breakfast-room, where his wife, Ida, and her stepmother were sitting at table, with pale, perturbed faces, and very little inclination for that excellent fare which the Wimperfield housekeeper provided with a kind of automatic regularity, and would have continued to provide on the eve of a deluge or an earthquake. He told Ida that all was going on quietly upstairs, and that he would share Towler's task as nurse all that day, so that she might be quite easy in her mind as to the patient. And then the servants came trooping in, as the clock struck 9, and they all knelt down, and John Jardine read the daily portion of prayer and praise. It had been decreed by medical authority that on this day, provided the sky were propitious and the wind in a warm quarter, Vernon was to go out for his first drive. Mr. Jardine accordingly entreated that the 3 ladies would accompany him, and that Ida would have no fear as to her husband's welfare during her absence. "I don't like to leave him," she said in confidence to Mr. Jardine. "He seems so much worse this morning, wilder than I have ever seen him yet, so white and haggard." "He is very bad, but your remaining indoors will do him no good. I will not leave him while you are away." Ida yielded. It was a relief to her to submit to authority, to have someone able to tell her to do this or that. She felt utterly worn out in body and mind. All the energy, the calm strength of purpose, which had sustained her up to a certain point, was now exhausted. Despair had taken possession of her, and with despair came that dull apathy which is like death in life. John Jardine took his wife aside before he went back to Brian's rooms. "I want you to take care of Ida, to keep her all day. She has been sorely tried, poor soul, and needs all your love." "She shall have it in full measure," answered Bessie. "How grave and anxious you look! Is Brian very ill? Very ill. Dangerously? I'm afraid so. I shall hear what Mr. Fosbrook says presently, and if his report be bad, I shall telegraph for the physician. Poor Brian! How strangely he talked at dinner last night. Oh, John, I hardly dare say it, but is he out of his mind? Temporarily, but it is the delirium of a kind of brain fever, not madness. And he will recover. Please God, but he is very low. I am seriously alarmed about him. Poor dear Brian, sighed Bess. He was once my favourite cousin. But I must go back to Ida. You need not be afraid of my neglecting her. I shan't leave her all day. Mr. Jardine went to the housekeeper's room to make an inquiry. He wanted to know what that box from London had contained, a box delivered upon such and such a date. The housekeeper's mind was dark, or worse than dark, upon the subject, an obscurity enlightened by flashes of delusive light. 2 housemaids and an odd man who looked after the coal scuttles were produced, and gave their evidence in a manner which would have laid them open to the charge of rank prevarication and perjury as to the receipt of a certain wooden box, which at some stages of the inquiry became hopelessly entangled with a hamper from the Petersfield fishmonger and a bandbox from Lady Palliser's Brighton milliner. "The carriage must have been paid," said the housekeeper. "That's the difficulty. If there'd been anything to pay, it would have been entered in my book. But when the carriage is paid, don't you see, sir, it's out of my jurisdiction, as you may say," with conscious pride in a free use of the English language, "and I may hear nothing about it." But now the odd man, after much thoughtful scratching of his head, was suddenly enlightened by a flash of memory from the Paleozoic darkness of 3 weeks ago. He remembered a heavy wooden box that had come in his dinner time. The fact of its coming at that eventful hour had evidently impressed him, and he carried it up to Mr. Wendover's own sitting-room. It was very heavy, and Mr. Wendover had told him that it contained books. "Did you open it for Mr. Wendover?" "No, sir. I offered to open it, but Mr. Wendover says he's got the tools himself, and would open it at his leisure. He had no call for the books yet awhile, he says, and didn't want it opened." "I see. The box contained books. Thank you. That's all I wanted to know." John Jardine had very little doubt in his mind now as to the actual contents of the box. He had no doubt that Brian, finding himself refused drink, for which he suffered the drunkard's incessant craving, had contrived to get himself supplied from London, and that if the fire of his disease had known no abatement, it was because the fuel that fed the flame had not been wanting. The only question that remained to be answered was how Brian, carefully attended as he had been, had managed to dispose of his secret store of drink, under the very eyes, as it were, of his keeper. But Mr. Jardine knew that the sufferer from alcoholic poison is no less cunning than the absolute lunatic, and that falsehood, meanness, and fraud seemed to be symptoms of the disease. When he went back to Brian's rooms, he found the patient lying on his bed, exhausted by the agitation and restlessness of the last few hours. He was not asleep, but was quieter than usual, in a semi-conscious state, muttering to himself now and then. Towler was sitting at a little table by the open window, breakfasting comfortably, his enjoyment of the coffee-pot and a dish of ham and eggs being in no manner lessened by the neighbourhood of the patient. "Haven't been able to get him to take any nourishment," whispered Towler, as Mr. Jardine came quietly into the room. "He's uncommon bad. Mr. Fosbrook will be here presently, I hope." "I don't think he'll be able to do much good when he does come," said Towler. "Doctors ain't in it with a case of this kind. If he don't go off into a good sleep by and by, I'm afraid this will be a fatal case." Mr. Jardine made no reply to this discouraging observation. There are times when speech is worse than useless. He stood by the window, looking over at that shrunken figure on the great old-fashioned 4-post bed, with its voluminous drab damask curtains, its cords, fringes, tassels, and useless decorations, the nerveless, helpless figure of wasted youth, the wreckage of an ill-spent life. The haggard countenance, damp with the dews of mental agony and of a livid pallor, looked like the face of death. What could medicine do for this man beyond diagnosing his case, and giving an opinion about it for the satisfaction, God save the mark, of his friends? John Jardine knew in his heart that not all the doctors in Christendom could pick this shattered figure up again and replace it in its former position among mankind. Still intent upon solving that mystery about the contents of the wine case, Mr. Jardine's eyes wandered about the room, trying to discover some hiding place which the careful Towler had overlooked. But so far he could see no such thing. There was the tall four-poster, with its square cornice, a ponderous mahogany frame, with the fluted damask stretched across it. Could Brian have hidden his brandy up yonder, behind the mahogany cornice? Surely not. First, the damask would have bulged with the weight of the bottles, and secondly, the place was not accessible enough. He must have hidden his poison in some spot where he could apply himself to it furtively, hurriedly, 20, 50, 100 times in the day or night. Presently, Mr. Jardine's glance fell on the half-open door of the bathroom. It was a slip of a room, cut off the study, a room that had been created within the last 20 years. It was the only room which Mr. Jardine had not inspected before he went down to breakfast. He pushed open the door and went in, followed by Towler, wiping the egginess and hamminess from his mouth as he went. "You kept your eye upon this room as well as the others, I suppose?" said Mr. Jardine, looking about him. "Yes, sir, I have kept an eye upon everything." The apartment was not extensive. A large copper bath, with a ponderous mahogany case, panelled, moulded, bevelled, the elaborate workmanship of local cabinet-makers, a row of brass hooks hung with bath-towels, which looked like surplices pendant in a vestry, a washstand in a corner, a dressing-table and glass, with its belongings, in the window, and a wicker armchair comprised the whole extent of furniture. No hiding-place here, one would suppose. Mr. Jardine looked about the room thoughtfully. It was the one apartment in which the patient could hardly be intruded upon by his attendant. Here he could be sure of privacy. "Did you examine the case of the bath?" he inquired presently, his mathematical eye quick to take in the difference between the inner shell of copper and the outer husk of mahogany. "No, sir," answered Towler briskly. "Is it holler?" "Of course it's hollow. Surely your eye tells you that." "Yes, sir, but there's the hot water pipes inside, and there's no getting at it except for a plumber." "Nonsense," said Mr. Jardine, kneeling down at one end of the bath, where there was a convenient mahogany door for the accommodation of the plumber, a door which lay somewhat in shadow and had escaped Towler's observation. "Bring me a candle," said Mr. Jardine, unconsciously imitating the brotherhood of plumbers, whose consumption of candles is a household terror. Towler returned to fetch a candle, while Mr. Jardine, with cautious hand, explored the cavern-like recesses between the bath and its outer shell, recesses in which lurked serpent-like convulsions of hot-water pipes and cold-water pipes, waste and overflow. Yes, before Towler could arrive with the candle, he had fathomed the mystery. 3 or 4 full bottles and a large number of empties were stowed away in this dusty receptacle. He drew one of the full bottles out into the light. "Hennessy's fine old cognac," said the label. This had been the secret source of fever and delirium. Here had lurked the evil which had made all remedial measures vain. Mr. Fosbrook was announced while John Jardine was washing the dust and the stains of rusty iron from his hands. Brian was in too low a condition to be rude to the country practitioner, much as he had protested against his interference. He suffered the apothecary to sit by his bed and feel his pulse, without a word of remonstrance. "How do you find him?" asked Mr. Jardine, when Mr. Fosbrook had left the bedside. "Very bad. Pulse small and thready, 140 in the minute, violent throbbing in the temporal and carotid arteries, profuse perspiration, all bad signs. What medicines has he been taking?" He was shown the prescriptions. Digitalis, bromide of potassium. I should like to inject chloral, but as the case is in Dr. Mallison's hands, if you think there is a danger, I will telegraph for Mallison. There is always danger in this stage of the malady, especially in the case of a patient of Mr. Wendover's age. The season, too, is unfavourable. The mortality in this complaint is nearly double in summer. If we can get him into a sound sleep of some hours, he may wake with a decided turn for the better, the delirium subjugated, but in his low state, even sleep may be fatal. There is so little vital power. Yes, I should certainly telegraph for Dr. Mallison, and in the meantime I'll try what can be done with chloral. You must do the utmost you can. Mrs. Wendover has implicit faith in you. I'll drive back and get the chloral." When the apothecary was gone, Mr. Jardine's first act was to telegraph to the London physician, his next to put the unused bottles of cognac under lock and key, and with Towler's help to clear away the empty bottles without the knowledge of the servants. No doubt every member of the household knew the nature of Mr. Wendover's illness, but it was well to spare him the exposure of these degrading details. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Englishman's house is his castle. Ida felt a strange relief to her spirits, despite the absolute blackness of her domestic horizon, when the carriage drove away from Wimperfield. She had left the house very seldom of late, feeling that duty chained her to the joyless scene of home, and there was an infinite relief in turning her back upon that stately white building in which was embodied all the misery of her blighted life. No charnel house could be fuller of ghastly, unspeakable horrors than Wimperfield had become to her since that long, never-to-be-forgotten night when she had listened to her husband's ravings, and when all the lonesome objects his distracted fancy had conjured into being, and his never-resting tongue had described, had been only a little less real to her mind than they had been to his. Could she ever again know the peace and rest in those rooms, ever tread those corridors without shuddering and dread, ever knowing happiness again in all the days of her life? She leaned back in the carriage as they drove along the avenue, and rested with half-closed eyes, her soul heavy within her, her body weighed down by the soreness and weariness of her mind. If life could but end now! She felt that she could be of no more use in the world. She could do nothing to help her wretched husband. He had chosen to go his own way to destruction, and he was too near the edge of the pit now to be snatched back by any friendly hand. She felt that his fate had passed beyond the regions of hope. God might pity the self-destroyer and deal lightly with him at the great audit, but on this earth there was no hope of cure. Brian Wendover was going down to the pit. Bessie sat by Ida's side, tenderly watching her worn, white face, while Lady Palliser was entirely absorbed by the delight of administering fussily to her boy, who was well enough to laugh her shawls and comforters and motherly precautions to scorn, and to jump about in the carriage as at each break in the wood some new object of interest caught his eye, a rabbit, a squirrel, a hawk high up in the blue, invisible to any gaze less eager than his own. He was in wild spirits at being out of doors again, a restless, eager soul, not to be restrained by any medical ordinances or maternal anxieties. They went for a long drive, the horses, very fresh after the little exercise of the last month, devouring the ground under them, the summer breeze brisk and inspiring, the country beautiful beyond measure, an ever-varying landscape of hill and wood and valley, green pastures and golden grain. Bessie chatted gaily in her desire to distract Ida's mind, and the boy's vivacity never flagged. But Ida sat silent, feeling the blessedness of this brief respite from the horror of home, but quite unable to talk of indifferent subjects. She was haunted by the image of her husband as she had seen him that morning, his ashen countenance, the perpetual movement of his eyes, those nervous, attenuated hands, almost transparent in their bloodlessness, forever pushing aside the formless horrors that crowded round him, pictures painted on the empty air, pictures forever changing, yet hideously real to that disorganized brain, pictures that spoke and gibbered at him, shadows with which he carried on conversations. With this awful image fresh in her mind, Ida could not even pretend to be cheerful or interested in common things. "Don't be unhappy about me, dear," she said once when Bessie squeezed her hand, and looked at her with tender anxiety. "I must bear my burden. Nobody can help me." "Except God," whispered the vicar's faithful wife. "He lightens all burdens in his good time." On the homeward road they wound near the base of Blackman's Hanger, and at this point Vernon got up and ordered the coachman to drive as near as he could to the old gamekeeper's cottage. "We can walk the rest of the way," said the boy. "Walk!" shrieked Lady Palliser. "Oh, Vernie, what are you dreaming about? Mr. Fosbrook never said you might walk." "Very likely not," retorted the boy. "But you don't suppose I'm going to ask old Fosbrook's leave before I use my legs? Look here, mother dear, I'm as well as I ever was, and I'm not going to be mollycoddled any more." "But, Vernie—" "I am not going to be mollycoddled any more, and I'm going to see old Jack." "Nonsense, Vernie." "He came to see me, and I'm going to see him," said Vernon resolutely. "Remember what your favourite author, the Countess of Seven Stars, said about the necessity of returning a call. And if the person calling happens to be your inferior in social status, the obligation to return the visit within a reasonable time will be so much the stronger. There, mother, there are the very words of your creme de la creme for you." "But, Vernon, the Countess would never have imagined such a person as Cheap Jack calling upon anyone for whom her book was intended." "The book was intended for a parcel of stuck-up cads," said Vernon. "Get on, Jackson." This to the coachman, who was driving slowly, perfectly conscious of the squabble going on behind him, and anticipating the reversal of Sir Vernon's order. But Lady Palliser said nothing. So Jackson quickened his pace a little, and drove along the rough, winding road which skirted the base of the hill. Directly he drew up his horses, Vernon leaped out, and the three women followed him. After all, the mother inwardly argued, it were a pity to thwart her darling. He was in such high spirits, and seemed so thoroughly himself again. His very wilfulness was delightful, for it told of renewed vigour. They all climbed the hill together, by a corkscrew track, which was not too distressing. The atmosphere was cool and fresh at this altitude, the odour of the pines ambrosial. "I suppose we had better wait a little way off, Vernie," said Ida, when they were within a dozen yards of the hut. "Your friend is so very uncivil to ladies." "Yes, you better rest yourselves on that fir tree," answered Vernon, pointing to a prostrate giant of the grove which had likely been felled, "while I run on and see him." They obeyed, but in less than 5 minutes Vernon came back. "Jack is out, but his house is open," he said eagerly, "and I want you all to come and see it. I want you to see the house that my Jack built." "But would it be right to go into his cottage when he is away?" asked Ida. "Of course it would," cried her brother, dancing along before them. "You must come. There's nothing to be ashamed of, I can tell you. Mother will see that my Jack isn't a vulgar person, that he can read and write, and has the ways of a gentleman." "I should certainly like to see what kind of person my son associates with," said Lady Palliser, who, in common with the non-studious class of mankind, was a keen inquirer into the details of daily life. She liked to know where her acquaintance had their gowns made, and what wages they gave their cooks, and to be the first to hear of matrimonial engagements and dangerous illnesses. The cottage door stood wide open, and as there was neither hall nor passage, the moment the three Fatimas had crossed the threshold they were standing in the innermost sanctuary of Mr. Cheap Jack's private life, and the character of the man stood revealed to them, so far as surroundings can reveal a man's character. He was a smoker, for the room, albeit the lattice stood wide open, smelt strongly of tobacco, and over the narrow wooden mantelpiece were slung 3 pipes, one a long cherry-wood tube of decidedly oriental appearance. "Quite gentlemanly-looking pipes," said Lady Palliser. The room was in perfect order, everything arranged with an exquisite neatness. The floor was covered with a coarse, substantial matting, spotlessly clean. The furniture consisted of a clumsy old walnut-wood table, evidently picked up at some farmhouse or cottage in the neighbourhood, a heavy piece of cabinet work of the same order, half secretaire, half bookcase, a couple of substantial armchairs, and a ponderous old oak chest, also the relic of some dismantled homestead. There was a brass clock on the chimney-piece, and there were a number of rather dingy-looking volumes in the bookcase, while the floor under the table was piled with quartos and thick octavos, which looked like books of reference. An old leathern dispatch box, much the worse for wear, stood on the table. Ornaments, pictures, or photographs, there were none. "It really looks like a gentleman's room," said Lady Palliser, after her eyes had devoured every detail. "It is a gentleman's room," answered Vernon, decisively. "Didn't I tell you my friend Jack is a gentleman?" "Vernon, dear, a man who goes about the country in a cart selling things can't be a gentleman," said his mother. "I don't quite see that, Lady Palliser," exclaimed Bessie, who was inspecting the bookshelves. "A gentleman may fall upon evil days, and have to earn his living somehow, don't you know? And why shouldn't he have a cart and go about selling things? There's nothing disreputable in it, though he could hardly go into society, perhaps, while he was driving the cart, because the mass of mankind are such fools. Why shouldn't Verney's instinct be right, and this Cheap Jack be a reduced gentleman? Froude says that in the colonies Oxford men may be seen mending the roads. Why shouldn't one man in the world have the courage to do humble work in his own country? This Jack is a university man." "How do you know that?" asked Lady Palliser eagerly. She was ready to bow down before a university man as a necessarily superior being. There had never been such a person of her own blood. "Here is a volume of Aeschylus, the Clarendon Press, with his college arms. He is a Balliol man, the same college as my cousin Brian's." "That proves nothing," said Lady Palliser contemptuously. "He may have bought the book at a stall. All his furniture is second-hand, why not his books?" "Oh, but there are more books with the Balliol arms. Pindar, Theocritus, Catullus, Horace, Virgil. Can't you find his name in any of them?" "No, that has been erased in some of the books, and has never been written in the others. Poor fellow! I dare say he would not like his real name to be known." "Didn't I tell you he was a gentleman, mother?" exclaimed Vernon triumphantly. Lady Palliser was almost convinced. The neat, substantially furnished room, so free from frippery and foppishness, the queer oriental pipes, the well-used books in sober calf bindings, which had once been splendid, the college arms on almost every volume, These details impressed her in spite of herself. "Poor young man, I should like to send him some money," she said. "He would not take it. He would scorn your money," said Vernon. "What does he want with pounds, shillings, and pence? He told me that so long as he has his books to read, his pipes to smoke, and a fine country to roam about, he cares for nothing else. Your money wouldn't buy him anything." "You don't understand, Vernie dear. We might do something substantial for him. Set him up in a nice little shop at Petersfield, perhaps a stationer's, or," with a glance at the rack of pipes, "a tobacconist's." "My Jack keeping a shop? My Jack behind a counter?" cried Vernon. "If you knew anything about him, you would never talk of such a thing. Why, he likes to be as free as the birds of the air, to roam about all day, and sit up reading half the night." They were all clustered in front of the bookcase, Bessie and Ida looking at the books, Lady Palliser and her boy intent on their own talk, when the door was flung open, and the master of the house suddenly appeared amidst them, a tall, broad-shouldered figure, roughly clad in shooting jacket, corduroy, and leather, like a gamekeeper, a dark bearded face under a slouched hat. But the intruders had only the briefest time in which to observe his appearance. At sight of the group by the bookcase, Jack tilted his felt hat further over his brows, and strode across the room to that corner whence a corkscrew stair led to the upper story. He went up these stairs in 3 or 4 bounds, banged and bolted the door of the upper chamber, and his unbidden guests were left looking at each other in bewildered silence. Lady Palliser, after a gasp or two, was the first to speak. "Did you ever see such a manner?" she exclaimed. "Such a perfect brute! Vernie, you must never speak to that horrid creature again. I never want to have anything more to do with university men if this is a specimen of their manners. Never so much as to take off his hat to us." "We had no right to come crowding into his room," said Bessie, who could seldom find it in her heart to be angry with anyone. "I dare say the poor thing feels the change in his position. When Brian of the Abbey comes home, if he ever does come home, I'll ask him to hunt this poor fellow out and help him in some way. One Balliol man ought to help another." "Let us go back to the carriage instantly," said Lady Palliser, almost shouting the substantive, in order that Jack might be reminded what kind of people he had insulted by his ruffianly bearing. "I feel that I am demeaning myself every moment I stay in this house." They hurried down the sandy hill path to the road where they had left the carriage, and Lady Palliser hustled them into it, breathless, with the combined effect of the rapid descent and her indignation. "Why, Ida, how deathly pale you are!" exclaimed Bessie. "I hope you are not ill. Have we walked too fast for you?" "No, dear, only that man's face reminded me of Brian's when he first came home from Norway, and was so dreadfully sunburnt," said Bessie. "So it did me. The idea flashed upon me, as the rude wretch rushed past us, that he had a sort of look of Brian, just the way he carried his head, you know, and something in the shape of his shoulders. Not a real resemblance. Of course not." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As one dead in the bottom of a tomb. Dr. Mallison came to Wimperfield at the same hour as on the occasion of his first visit. He was with the patient for nearly half an hour, and he confabulated with Mr. Fosbrook for at least another half-hour, so it could not be said that he performed the physician's duty in a careless or perfunctory manner. But his opinion was not hopeful, and there was a gravity in his manner when he talked to Ida and her stepmother, which was evidently intended to prepare them for the worst. He gave a peremptory order for a second nurse, an able-bodied, experienced woman, who could relieve Towler in his now most onerous duties growing hourly more painful, since the last development of the patient's delirium was a violent hatred of his attendant, who, as he believed, was always lying in wait to do him some injury. Dr. Mallison also advised that Mrs. Wendover should no longer occupy the bedroom adjoining her husband's. Upon this point he was very firm, when Ida urged her anxiety to forego no duty which she owed to her husband. "I am so sorry for him," she said. "I would do anything in the world to help or to comfort him." "Unhappily, dear madam, you can do neither. When these paroxysms are upon him, he will mistake his best friend for his worst enemy. He was quite violent to Towler just now. You can do absolutely nothing, and your presence is even likely to irritate him. He must be given over entirely to his nurses. Towler will obey my directions implicitly, and the female attendant, Mr. Fosbrook tells me he can find a thoroughly competent person, will assist him in carrying them out. If we can stimulate the patient's vital power, which is just now at the lowest ebb, and if we can induce natural sleep, why, there may still be a favourable result. But I do not conceal from you that Mr. Wendover's condition is critical, very critical. Lady Palliser, you will insist, I hope, that your daughter removes to an apartment at some distance from her husband's, for the present. A few days hence, when the delirium is subjugated, as I trust it may be, by the removal of the exciting cause, Mrs. Wendover may resume her attendance upon her husband. Just at present, the less she sees of him, the better for both." Ida could not disobey this injunction, especially as Lady Palliser and Mrs. Jardine took the matter into their own hands. Jane Dyson was ordered to convey all Mrs. Wendover's belongings to a room on the second and topmost floor of the mansion, exactly over that she now occupied, a fine airy apartment with a magnificent view, but less lofty and less ponderously furnished than the apartments on the first floor. Bessie vowed that this upper chamber, with its French bedstead, the light chintz draperies, and maple furniture, was a much prettier room than the one below. She ran up and down the stairs, carrying flowers, Japanese fans, tea-tables, and other frivolities, until she made the new room a perfect bower, and then carried Ida off triumphantly to inspect her new quarters. "Isn't it lovely?" she said. "Such a nice change. Do let us have our tea up here, if that good Dyson won't mind bringing it. Nearly 6 o'clock, and we haven't had a cup of tea. I do so enjoy thoroughly new surroundings. We'll have the table just in front of this window. What a sweet architect to give this room windows down to the ground, and a lovely balcony. You must have some large Japanese vases in the balcony, Ida. That lovely deep red or orange tawny. Oh, you poor pet, how wretched you look." "I have just been talking to the new nurse, Bessie. She seems a good, honest creature. She has nursed other people in the same complaint, and she thinks Brian is desperately ill." "Oh, but he may get over it, dear. The London doctor did not give him up, and there is no good in making yourself ill with worry and fear. If you do, you won't be able to wait upon Brian when he begins to get better, and convalescents want so much attention, don't you know?" The tea came, and Bessie persuaded her friend to take some, prattling on all the time in the hope of diverting Ida from the silent contemplation of her trouble. But the horror of the case had taken too stern a hold upon Ida's brain. It was the dominant idea. As with the somnambulist, whose perceptions are dead to every other subject, save the one absorbing thought, and all subsidiary ideas linked with it by the subtle chain of association. Ida smiled a wan smile, and pretended to be interested in Bessie's parochial anecdotes, the idiosyncrasies of the new curate, the fatuity of every young woman in the parish in running after him. "He is such a perfect stick, but then certainly there is no other single man in the parish under 40. He is like Robinson Crusoe. It is an awfully deceptive position for a young man to occupy. I know he is beginning to think himself quite handsome, while as for pimples, well, His face is like a Wiltshire meadow before it has been bush-harrowed." Ida did not go down to dinner that evening. She felt utterly unequal to the effort of pretended cheerfulness, and she did not want to inflict a countenance of stone gloom upon Mr. and Mrs. Jardine, or on Vernie, who was going to dine late for the first time since his illness. So she sat by the open window overlooking the woods, grey in the universal twilight greyness, and she read Victor Cousin's History of Philosophy, which was a great deal more comforting than fiction or poetry would have been, as it carried her into regions of abstract thought where human troubles entered not. For the next 3 days things went on quietly enough. Brian never left his own apartments, now in ample range, since Ida's bedroom had been thrown into the suite, so as to give him space and verge enough for his roaming when the restless fit was on him. And alas, how seldom did he cease from his restlessness! He now saw scarcely anyone but his nurses and Mr. Fosbrook, who called 3 times a day, and was altogether devoted in his watchfulness of the case. Ida had not ceased from visiting the invalid until it became too obvious that her presence was irritating to him. He recalled the most painful scenes of their past experience, raved about his marriage, and accused his wife of cruelty and greed of wealth, wept, stormed, blasphemed, until Ida rushed shuddering from the room. To the nurses this wild talk was only part and parcel of the patient's hallucinations. To Ida it was too real. Mr. Jardine and his wife stayed till the end of the week, but on Saturday the vicar was compelled to go back to his parishioners, and although Bessie wanted to remain at Wimperfield, separating herself from her husband for the first time in her wedded life, Ida would not consent to such a sacrifice. Vernon, who was pronounced thoroughly convalescent, was to go back to Salisbury Plain with the Jardines, everybody being agreed that Wimperfield Park was no place for him under the existing circumstances. If Brian's malady were doomed to end fatally, it was well that the boy should be gone before the dreaded guest crossed the threshold. Ida saw her friends depart with a sense of despair too deep for words. She hugged Vernie with the passionate fervour of one who never hoped to see him more. She felt as if it were she whose hours were numbered, she for whom the thin thread of life was gradually dwindling to nothingness. The very atmosphere was charged with the odour of death. The light was shadowed by the gloom of the grave. Again and again, in troubled dreams, she had recalled that dreadful scene in the church with Brian, and she had seen the worms crawling out through the mouldering timbers of the church floor. She had smelt the sickening taint of corruption. She stood in the portico in the early summer morning, watching Mr. Jardine's phaeton dwindle to a speck in the distance of the avenue. And then she went slowly back to the house, feeling as if she were quite alone in her misery. It was not that Fanny Palliser was wanting in kindness or sympathy, but she was wanting in comprehension of Ida's feelings, and the stronger nature could not lean upon the weaker, and then the mother would be absorbed in her grief at the loss of her boy, who had become doubly precious since his illness. No, Ida felt that now John Jardine was gone, she must bear her burden alone. Help for her, strength outside her own courageous nature, there was none. She longed on this exquisite morning to be roaming about the park and woods, or riding far afield, but she had made up her mind that, so long as her husband remained in his present critical condition, it was her duty to stay close at hand, within call, lest at any moment there might be a return to reason, and she might again have the power to soothe and support him, as she had done many a time in the long downhill progress of his malady. With this idea she spent the greater part of her day in the bedroom which Bessie had made so bright and so comfortable. Here she was within easy reach of the nurse in the rooms below, and could be summoned to her husband without a minute's delay. Here she had her favourite books, and the view of the park and woods in all their summer glory. She could sit out in her balcony, reading, or looking idly at the wide expanse of hill and valley, brooding sadly over days that were gone, full of fear for the immediate present, and not daring to face the dreaded future. "Don't think me unsociable," she said to Lady Palliser, before going back to her room after a hasty breakfast, "but I am too completely miserable to put on the faintest show of cheerfulness, and I should only make you wretched if I were with you. Go out for a drive, and pay a few visits, mamma. You have had a trying time, and you must want a little change of scene." "I believe I do, Ida," replied Lady Palliser gravely. "I feel that I am below par, and that I really want sea air. What should you think of our going to Bournemouth directly after the funeral?" "The funeral?" murmured Ida, pale as death. "Yes, dear. Mr. Fosbroke has quite given up all hope, I know. And after the funeral you will want a change as badly as I do. I thought it would be as well to write to the Bournemouth agent to secure nice apartments, for I shouldn't care about staying at a hotel." "Oh, mamma, don't make your plans so much beforehand. Wait till he is dead," said Ida bitterly. There seemed to her something ghoulish and stony-hearted in this prevision of coming doom, this arrangement for making the best of life and being comfortable when the sufferer upstairs should have ceased from the struggle with man's last foe. Lady Palliser contrived to get on without her stepdaughter's society. She had Jane Dyson, who was a person of considerable conversational powers, and who had an inexhaustible wellspring of interesting discourse in her recollections of the Archbishop's wife's lingering illness. The mistress and maid spent the morning not unpleasantly in conversation of the charnel house order, and in looking over Lady Palliser's wardrobe, with a view to discovering what new mourning she would require in the event of Brian's death. She had liked him, and had been kind to him in life, and she was not going to stint him in death by any false economy in crape or bugles. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A fiery dawn. The Jardines had been gone 3 days, and there was no change either for good or evil in Brian's condition. Mr. Fosbroke admitted that he was as ill as he could possibly be. The malady must either take a turn for the better or end fatally within a day or two. The servants all talked of the impending funeral as complacently as Lady Palliser. The event must happen, and it would be as well to make the best of it. They had not yet gone out of mourning for Sir Reginald, and here was another death at hand to start them again with new suits of black. This was one of the advantages of service in a really good family, where the King of Terrors was treated with proper distinction. It was 11 o'clock at night, and the house was hushed in silence, save in that suite of rooms where the invalid and his nurses were hardly ever at rest. One of the men servants slept in his clothes on a truckle bed in the corridor, ready for service in any emergency. Everyone else had gone to bed, except Ida, who sat at her open window, looking out at the wild, windy sky and the forest trees swaying in the gale. The day had been rainy and tempestuous, and the wind was still raging, just such a wind as Ida remembered upon Bessie's birthday, the day of that terrible storm which had cost so many lives, and had made Reginald Palliser master of Wimperfield. She sat gazing idly at the sky, in sheer despondency and weariness. Her devotional books, which had been her chief comfort in these dark days and nights, lay unopened on her table. The effort to read any other kind of literature had been abandoned for the last day or two. Her mind refused to understand the words which her eyes mechanically perused. She could only read such books as spoke of comfort to a weary soul, of hope beyond a sinful world. She had eaten hardly anything for the last few days, living on cups of tea, and semi-transparent slices of bread and butter. Her nights had been almost sleepless, her brief snatches of slumber disturbed by hideous dreams. She was thoroughly worn out in body and mind, and as she sat by the open window, loosely dressed in a tea-gown, with a china crape shawl wrapped round her shoulders, the monotonous moaning of the wind in the elms had a soothing sound like a lullaby, and hushed her to sleep. She lay back in her low, luxurious chair, with her head half buried in the comfortable down pillow, and slept as she had not slept for a month. It was the slumber of sheer exhaustion, deep and sweet, and long, very long, for when she opened her eyes and looked about her, awakened by a strange oppression of the chest, there was the livid light of earliest dawn in the room, a light that changed all at once to a bright red glow, vivid as the sky at sundown. The oppression of her breath increased. She felt suffocated. The livid dawn, the crimson sunset, changed to grey. The atmosphere around her grew thick. There was a smarting sensation in her eyes, a stifling sensation in her throat. Mechanically, not knowing what she did, she began to grope her way to the door. But in that thickening atmosphere she did not know which was the door. Her outspread arms clasped some heavy piece of furniture, the wardrobe. She leaned against it, exhausted, helpless and stupefied by that horrible smoke. And as she leaned there, a wild, shrill shriek pealed out from below, the cry of "Fire!" Again and again that dreadful cry resounded, in a woman's piercing treble. Then came a hubbub of other voices. Without, within, she could not tell where, or how near, or how far, but all the sounds seemed distant. She could just see the open window by which she had been sleeping a few minutes ago. She could distinguish it by the red light outside, which was just visible through the dense smoke within, momently thickening. She made for the window, anything to escape from that suffocating atmosphere. But just as she was approaching that red patch of light shining amidst the blackness, a sudden tongue of flame shot up from below, caught the light chintz drapery, and in an instant the window was framed in fire. The flame ran from one curtain to another, fanned by the wind which was still blowing. Valance, draperies, all the ornamentation of the 3 windows were in blaze. Ida stood helpless, motionless as Lot's wife confronting the flames. To rush through them, to leap through the open window, although it were to certain death, was her first impulse. Any death must be better than to fall down suffocated on the floor and to be burned alive. Then came the thought of her husband, so weak and mad and helpless, of her stepmother. Were they, too, in danger of instant death, or was she on this upper floor the only victim? The thin chintz curtains flamed and blazed into nothingness while she was looking at them. The woodwork round the windows crackled and blistered, but the flame died out into ashes. Only the intolerable smoke remained, and the ever-increasing glow of the fire below, more vivid with every moment. She made one mad rush for the balcony. Great heaven! What a scene greeted her eyes as she looked downwards! Masses of flame, mingled with black smoke clouds, were being vomited out of the lower windows. There was a little crowd of men below, gardeners, stablemen, who lived close at hand. Some of these were making feeble efforts with garden engines, sending out little jets of water which seemed only to feed the flames, as if the water had been oil, while others were trying to adjust a fire escape, deposited in the stables years ago, in the reign of Sir Reginald's father, and out of working order from long disuse. 3 or 4 grooms were rushing to and fro with buckets, and splashing water against the stone walls, with an utter absence of any effect whatever. Ida stood in the balcony, leaning against the ironwork, waiting for rescue or death. The atmosphere was a little less stifling here, but every now and then a dense cloud of smoke rolled over her and almost suffocated her before the wind drove it upward. The sky was alight with reflected fire. The burning pyre of Dido or Sardanapalus could hardly have made a grander effect, and far away in the east, against the dark undulations of wooded hills, there was another light, the tender roseate flush of summer dawn, full of promise and peace. Ida stood with clasped hands and lips moving dumbly in prayer. She gave her soul back to her Creator. She prayed for pardon for her sins. She closed her eyes, waiting meekly for death. Suddenly, as she prayed, full of resignation, the balcony creaked under a footstep. A strong arm was wound round her waist. She was lifted bodily over the iron rail and carried carefully, firmly, easily down a ladder, amidst a shout of rapture from the little crowd below. Every Englishman is not heroic, but every Englishman knows how to admire heroism in his fellow man. Before the bearer of his burden reached the lowest rung of the ladder, Ida was unconscious. She lay lifeless and helpless in her preserver's arms. When they were on the solid ground, he bent his bare head over hers, which rested on his shoulder, and kissed her on the forehead. The crowd saw and did not condemn the action. "It might be a liberty," said the head gardener, "but he earned the right to do it. None of us could have done what he did." When Ida awakened to consciousness, she was lying in the lodge-keeper's little bedroom at the park gates, and her stepmother was seated at the bedside, ready to offer her the usual remedy for all feminine woes, a cup of tea. "Thank God you are safe," said Ida, the memory of that terrible dawn quickly recurring in her mind, a little bewildered at the first moment by her strange surroundings. "Where is Brian?" Fanny Palliser burst into tears. "Oh, Ida, it was Brian set the house on fire, in one of his mad fits, hunting for some horrible thing behind his bed-curtains, and poor Towler and the nurse were both asleep when it happened. At least, Towler, who was sitting up with him, had fallen into a doze, and heard Brian talk about looking for serpents in the curtains, and then about flames and fire, but didn't take any notice, or so much as open his eyes, for his talk had been so often of fire and flames, poor creature. And when he woke, the room was in a blaze, and the fire had spread through the open door to the window curtains in the next room. Towler and the nurse and Rogers all did their utmost, and risked their lives trying to get Brian away. But he wouldn't leave the burning rooms. He got wilder and wilder, and then, just as they were calling a couple of the stablemen to help them, meaning to get him away by main force, he rushed to the window and threw himself out." "And he was killed," cried Ida. "Yes, the shock killed him. But you know, dear, there's no use in fretting. Mr. Fosbrook says that he could not have lived till the end of the week. His constitution was quite gone. It was a happy release." "Not such a death," murmured Ida, tears streaming down her wan cheeks. "Such a death could not be a happy release." Lady Palliser shook her head, and sighed plaintively. Perhaps she had been inclined to take the survivor's view of the question. Euthanasia, to Fanny Palliser's mind, meant a death which relieves the family of the deceased from the burden of a long illness. "He did not suffer at all, dearest," she said soothingly. "Mr. Fosbrook said the shock killed him. There were no bones broken. He fell on the grass in front of the library windows. And oh, Ida, what a blessing that everything at Wimperfield is fully insured. The house is completely gutted." Ida could not feel sorry about Wimperfield. The place had been to her of late the abode of horror. If she could be glad of anything in her present frame of mind, it would have been to know that Wimperfield House was razed to the ground. "The portico and the walls are standing," pursued Lady Palliser, "and no doubt a clever architect will be able to build the house up again in the old style." But, Mamma, it was an ugly, uninteresting house, not 100 years old. Exactly so. If it had been really an old house, one would be glad to get rid of it, but it was all as good as new, and so thoroughly substantial. And how can you call it ugly, with such a portico? I can't imagine. I wonder you have not more classical taste. I love anything Grecian. The only thing I ever felt proud of at La Fontaine was the plaster urns with scarlet geraniums in them. Mamma, how was I saved? Who was it saved me? Asked Ida presently, when she had taken her cup of tea and the Swiss clock over the chimney-piece had struck 9. The sun was shining through the open lattice and upon the roses and the lilies in the little lodge garden. Everything wore a glad and cheerful aspect in the summer morning. "Ah, my dear, that is a story!" exclaimed Lady Palliser, nodding her head with intense significance, and pleased at being able to divert Ida's thoughts from her husband's miserable end. "I never did. You will be surprised. Oh, my dear, I thought it was all over with you. All the gardeners and stablemen were there, and Rogers, and John and William and Henry, half dressed and in slippers, poor creatures, and I begged and implored of them to save you, to get to your room somehow, inside or out, but the staircase to the second floor was choked with smoke and flame and falling timbers. One of the men tried to go up, but he came back and said he must wait for the firemen. Nobody but a fireman could do it. And then they got ladders, but the first ladder wasn't long enough, and nobody seemed to be in their proper senses. Thomas rode off to Petersfield for the engine directly the fire broke out, but that's 8 miles off, as you know, and it all seemed hopeless. I was running about among them like a mad woman in my dressing-gown and slippers, and as for Jane Dyson, she sat on the lowest step of the portico and went out of one fit of hysterics into another, just as she did when the Archbishop's wife died. And I thought all hope was over, when a man rushed in among us, snatched the longest ladder from the men who were bringing it from the walled garden, and put it up against the balcony. He went up it just like a sailor, and before I could hardly breathe he was coming down again with you in his arms, safe and sound. And who do you think the man was?" "The fire brigade man, I suppose." "Not a bit of it. The man who saved you was Verney's friend, Cheap Jack." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sole partner and sole part of all these joys. More than a year had gone by since that awful night, and a new Wimperfield house was slowly rising from the ashes of the Bath stone mansion with the Grecian portico. Only the walls and the portico had remained intact after the fire, and these had been pulled down to make room for a spacious edifice in the early English manner, the heavy insurances on the old building providing for the cost of this newer and more beautiful Wimperfield. But Ida was not near to watch the new Wimperfield in the progress of erection. She had spent the greater part of the last year at the homestead with Miss Wendover, and the residue with her stepmother at Bournemouth, where Lady Palliser had taken and furnished for herself one of the pretty villas on the Boscombe estate, a pleasant home for the placid joys of widowhood, and a nice place for Vernon's holidays, were he contented to spend them there, which he was not, greatly preferring the more rustic life at Kingthorpe. Here he was a welcome guest both at the Knoll and at the homestead, while there was a third house open to him within a walk of the village, for Mr. Wendover had returned from his distant wanderings, and he and Verney were on very friendly terms. Ida had as yet seen but little of the master of the Abbey, albeit she heard of him almost daily from some of the Knoll family. He had returned at Easter, unexpectedly, as usual, and much to the surprise of a neighbourhood which had grown accustomed to the idea of his never coming back at all. But although he had settled himself at the Abbey, declaring that he had made an end of his wanderings, seen all he wanted to see, and never meant to go far afield any more, he had taken no share in the picnics and rustic festivities with which the Knoll family celebrated their worship of the great god Pan, whereupon Blanche informed her cousin frankly that he was not half so nice as he had been 7 years ago, when he had joined in their fungus hunts and barrow hunts and blackberry gatherings, just as if he had been one of themselves. 7 years ago I was 7 years younger, Blanche. We were all children then. Blanche sighed and shook her head despondently. As for me, I feel centuries old, she said. But that is only natural in such a dead and alive hole as Kingthorpe. Which speech, being interpreted, meant that Miss Wendover had not had a new frock or an invitation to a garden party for the last fortnight. Still, she argued, one ought to make the best of one's life even at Kingthorpe, and picnics and rambles help one to endure existence. You used to be such a delightful companion, and now no one but little Vernie ever seems to get any fun out of you. He is always talking of the larks he has at the Abbey. Sir Vernon is good enough to call the mildest form of diversion a lark, said Brian Wendover, smiling at her. Come now, I will make a bargain with you, said Blanche. John Jardine and Bess are coming over next week to spend Bessie's birthday with us, which, as you know, is a family festival that we never allow to be celebrated anywhere else. Bess and John and the babies are coming to us, and Vernon Palliser is going to the homestead, and his mother is coming over from Bournemouth to stay a few days with Aunt Betsy. So, you see, it will be a grand family gathering of Wendovers and Pallisers. Now, if you are anything like the man you were 7 years ago, prove it by joining us on this occasion. I cannot refuse, and I will try my uttermost to forget that I have lived 7 lonely years since that happy summer. Ah, it was a happy summer, sighed Blanche, who affected to be weighed down by the burden of mature years. I wasn't out in those days. I hadn't a care. What form does your festival take this year, and where do you mean to celebrate it? Oh, a picnic, of course, if this lovely weather only holds out. We have not had one really proper picnic this year. But don't you think the 7th of September is just a little late for an al fresco feast? Suppose we were to make it luncheon and afternoon tea at the Abbey, with unlimited tennis in the afternoon. That would be simply delicious, said Blanche, concluding that Mr. Wendover intended to invite all the eligible young men of his acquaintance to be found within 20 miles. Then it is agreed. You need give yourself no further trouble. You have only to bring your people, the Knoll party and the Homestead party. Precisely. And of course you can ask as many as you like. The year which was gone had been one of perfect peace for Ida, peace overshadowed by the memories of pain and horror. But those memories had been lightened, and her mind had been comforted and soothed and fortified by Aunt Betsy's loving companionship, by that common sense and broad way of thinking which was as a tower of strength in the day of trouble. Yet for months after that awful time at Wimperfield, her nights had been broken by dreadful dreams, or too vivid reminiscences of her husband's evil fate, that terrible decay of mind and body, that gradual annihilation of the energies and powers of manhood which it had been her painful lot to witness. Aunt Betsy took care that the young widow's days should be too busy for much thought. She found constant occupation for her. She sent her about to the remotest corners of the parish to minister to the sorrows of others. She gave her the sick to nurse, and the old and feeble to care for, and the young to teach, so that there should be no leisure left from dawn to sunset for futile lamenting over the irrevocable past. But in the silence of night those dreaded memories crept out of their hiding-places, as other vermin creep out of their holes under the cover of darkness, and it was long before they began to grow less vivid and terrible. From the moment Miss Wendover appeared at Wimperfield on the afternoon after the fire, coming as quickly after the receipt of the news as horses could convey her, Ida had been sheltered and protected by her love. No sooner was Brian laid at rest in his grave in Wimperfield churchyard than Aunt Betsy carried off the hopeless, broken-down widow to the homestead, where Ida resumed all her old duties, so that there were times when it seemed as if all the years of her married life were but a dream from which she had awakened, a dream which had subdued and saddened her whole nature, and had made her feel old and weary. But there was much of happiness in her life, so much that she was fain to put aside all signs and tokens of grief, except her dense black gowns and crape bonnets, and to rejoice with those who rejoiced. For here was Aunt Betsy, the most cheery and unselfish of women, whose life ought to be all sunshine, inasmuch as she spent so large a portion of it brightening the lives of others. And here were the boys and girls from the Knoll, always in uproarious spirits, and wanting Ida's sympathy in all their delights. And here was Vernon coming over from the vicarage on Salisbury Plain, at all times and seasons, for a few days' holiday, rosier and stronger and more sporting every time she saw him, great upon hawking and hunting, and full of grand schemes for his future life at the new Wimperfield. He had forgotten Brian's melancholy doom, as easily as youth is apt to forget everything, in the hurry and ardour of life's morning. But his love for his sister knew no abatement. He wanted her to share in all his future joys. "You are not going to stay at the homestead all your life, are you?" he asked one day. "Of course you are going back to Wimperfield directly the new house is finished." "No, dear. I could never live at Wimperfield again. It would recall too many sad scenes. When Aunt Betsy is tired of me, I shall go abroad. I have seen so little of the world, you know." "Oh, if you want to travel, you can go with me when I come of age. But in the meantime you must help Mother to keep the house at Wimperfield. It will be quite a new place, everything new, nothing to remind you of Father or Brian. And then, in a few years, I shall be of age, and then we can go off to the Rockies together, with Cheap Jack for our guide, philosopher, and friend," said Ida. "Well, no. I'm afraid Cheap Jack won't go with us," answered Vernon, laughing. "I have such a reason to be grateful to him that I could hardly object to his company," said Ida. "And I am quite unhappy at never having been able to thank him, or reward him for saving my life." "He didn't want to be thanked or rewarded. Didn't I tell you he was not that kind of man? But why should any man go through life doing good to others, and never getting thanks or praise for his goodness?" said Ida. "It is a most unpleasant form of misanthropy. I feel quite uncomfortable under the burden of my obligations to Mr. Jack, and though I have made every effort to put myself in communication with him, through Mr. Mason and others, I have not been able to find out where he is or anything about him." "Odd, isn't it?" said Vernon. "He left the cottage on the day after the fire, didn't he? Shut it up, and took the key to Lord Pontifex's steward, and drove off with his books and things packed in his cart, goodness knows where, after having made a free gift of his stock to the villagers." "Not a very profitable way of carrying on business," said Ida. "He must have had means independent of his trade." "Well, I don't suppose we shall ever see him again," returned Vernon cheerfully, somewhat to Ida's disgust, for this indifference to the sudden close of a once enthusiastic friendship argued a lightness and fickleness of disposition in Sir Vernon Palliser. And now it was again the eve of Bessie's birthday, that day which had twice been fraught with fatal influences for Bessie's friend, and Ida could not put away the feeling that the 7th of September, finding her once again on the scene of past fatalities, must needs bring her some new evil, some undreamed-of crisis in her life. Yet what would happen to her now? She asked herself. The play was played out. She had lived her life. For her, tragedy and comedy were alike over and done with. The morning of the 7th dawned fair and bright. If there were any omen in those pinky clouds which flecked the tender grey of early morning, surely it must be a portent of good and not of evil, although Lady Palliser, who was not given to over-cheerful views, declared at breakfast that such roseate hues in early morning meant bad weather before noon. "Let the weather be never so unkind, we'll find a way of enjoying ourselves at the Abbey," said Aunt Betsy, who was in tremendous spirits. "Won't we, Vernie?" "Of course," answered Vernon. "Mother has a new bonnet, and is afraid of getting it spoiled. The weather won't interfere with us. We can play hide and seek in the Abbey cellars." "Oh, Vernie, and get shut behind a secret panel, or in a chest, like that poor girl in the poem Ida used to read to us." "Don't be afraid, Mother. If I get into a chest, you may depend I shall know how to get out of it. That girl in the poem was a duffer for not having made more row, and her lover was a beastly sneak for not ferreting out her hiding-place." "They ought to have had a detective down from London," remarked Lady Palliser, ignoring both the scene and the date of the story. Her readings had lain much among novels in which the private detective was omnipotent, the unraveller of all mysteries, the avenger of every wrong. Miss Wendover drove Lady Palliser to the Abbey in her phaeton, and the party from the Knoll went in the roomy family wagonette. But Vernon and his sister walked across the fields and the common, by that path which Ida had trodden on the day she first saw the master of the Abbey. How vividly she recalled her feelings on that day, the pain and embarrassment she felt in Brian Wendover's presence, the agony of humiliation. And then had followed the too happy, too perilous days in which he had been her familiar friend, the fatal night on which he had declared himself her lover. Well, she was free now. She could meet him and think of him without sin. But since his return, she had met him at most a half-dozen times, and then always in the company of other people. He had greeted her cordially, as friend should greet friend, but he had not sought her society. He knew that she was living in his aunt's house, but he had only been to that house once since his return. Time was, time is, time's past, said the brazen oracle. Ida began to tell herself that for her time was verily past. Life and youth and love had been hers, but fate had been adverse, and she had wasted them, and they were over and gone. She had some time for pensive reverie as she walked to the Abbey, Vernon being as usual more occupied by the inhabitants of the hedges and ditches than by his companion. But once arrived at the Abbey, there was no time for sadness. Bessie was on the threshold to welcome her, and the whole Knoll family were swarming in the great hall, where Brian, standing under the picture of the famous Sir Tristram, was giving cordial welcome to everyone. How handsome he looked under the likeness of his ancestor, and how vividly the modern face recalled the ancestral lineaments. Time had only deepened the noble lines of his countenance, and added dignity to his figure and bearing. He looked happy, too, like a man upon whom the future smiles assuringly. The fancy flashed across Ida's mind that he was engaged to be married, and that he meant to announce the fact to his family to-day, perhaps, and to introduce the lady. She looked hastily round the hall, almost expecting to see some new face, young, lovely, beaming with smiles, the face of the chosen one. But there was no one except Lady Palliser and the house of Wendover. "I have not asked any strangers, Blanche," said Brian. "I thought we should all have more fun if we had the old place to ourselves." "How good of you," replied the matronly Bess. "I'm sure we shall all enjoy ourselves ever so much more." Blanche was disappointed. Lawn tennis among relations was all very well, but she had plenty of that at the Knoll. She felt sorry she had put on her best hat and Indian silk frock, elaborately frilled with twine-coloured lace. A cotton gown and the oldest thing in garden hats would have been good enough for such an assembly. The Colonel and Mrs. Wendover had driven over with their children. It was quite a family party. Bessie's babies, a girl able to toddle, and a boy in the nurse's arms, were the great features of the entertainment, the grandmother openly worshipping them, the grandfather condescending to occasional patronage of this third generation, but evidently anxious to dissemble his pride. "Bessie makes such a preposterous fuss about her babies," said Blanche, after declining lawn tennis with Eva and her two brothers. "I hope if I ever am deluded into marrying, I shall not degenerate into an upper nurse." The Abbey had been swept and garnished in honour of the occasion, every room brightened with flowers, even that sacred apartment, Brian's study, thrown open to the public. After luncheon it happened, somehow, Ida could hardly have explained how, that she and Brian were alone together in this very room, the afternoon sunlight shining on them. For in spite of Lady Palliser's prophecy, the day had been lovely, the scent of stocks and mignonette and sweet peas blowing in upon them from the old-fashioned garden at the back of the Abbey. They had strayed to this spot with the others, and the others had strayed off and left them, Ida looking absently at the backs of the Greek dramatists, Brian looking intently at her. "I don't think you have been in this house since the day we first met in the hall below?" he said, interrogatively. "No, I have never been here since." "And yet you were once fond of the Abbey. You used to like wandering about the old house and gardens. You would sit reading in the library. The housekeeper has often talked to me about you." She stood before him with lowered eyelids, pale and dumb, shrinking from him almost as she had shrunk from him 7 years ago by the old sundial in the moonlit garden, when it was a sin to listen to his ardent avowal. "Ida, why are you so silent? Why will you not speak of the past?" "The past is past," she said, falteringly. "It was full of grief and shame for me. I want to forget it if I can." "Forget all that is bitter. Remember all that is sweet," he pleaded, drawing nearer to her. "There is much of that old time which is unspeakably dear to me. The happy time in which I first loved you, deeming you were free to be loved and won. You are free now, Ida, sole mistress of your fate and mine, and I love you as dearly now as I loved you 7 years ago." "More I could not love you, for I loved you then with all my heart and mind. Ida, you once talked of being mistress of Wendover Abbey. Its master is at your feet, your faithful slave to the end of his life. Will you have this house for your own, Ida, and thus only make it home for me?" His arm was round her, gently, experimentally, the answer not being quite certain even yet. She slowly lifted the dark-fringed lids, looked at him with adoring eyes which never before had looked thus upon the face of a man. "Can you be in earnest?" she asked, in a low, sweet voice. "Can you lift me so high, I, that had fallen so low?" He clasped her to his heart, and sealed the promise of their unclouded future with a passionate kiss. At last, I hold you in my arms," he said fondly. "But not for the first time, my angel." "What do you mean?" "Who was it carried you out of the burning house last year?" he asked, smiling at her. "Cheap Jack." "I was Cheap Jack." "You?" "Yes. I lived far from the sight of this dear face as long as I could bear my life, and then, after 5 years of exile in far lands, where my soul sickened for the sight of you, I came back to England, heard in London that your husband was an idler and a drunkard, and foresaw evil days for my darling. I could be nothing to her, but at least I could watch over her, near at hand, yet unknown. So I took up my abode on the Hanger within a mile or so of her dwelling. Don't pity me, dearest. It was not a hard life after all. I had my books and nature for my companions, all the joy I could have, not having you." "However shall I repay you?" Only look up to me as you looked just now, and let me feel you are my own forever. End of chapter 31. End of The Golden Calf by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Reading by Tara Dow.